the ash-colored sky above Arvin, for had not cleared in months. Once blue horizons were choked with drifting soot and the fractured husks of warships, their broken silhouettes caught in the planet's orbit like bones suspended in a shallow grave. Beneath those looming relics, scattered across the scarred plains, were the men who refused to die quietly. Commander Raul Varen stood among them, cloak torn, rifle strapped across his back, eyes fixed on the horizon as though he could will the sun to pierce the dust. His men needed him to look forward, even when all they saw was ruin. The Volari Union had abandoned them. That truth weighed heavier than the armor on their shoulders or the hunger gnawing at their stomachs. Entire fleets had once promised aid, banners of alliance raised in solemn oath, yet when the insectoid swarm closed its jaws on Arvin IV, the Grand Council voted to cut ties. The colony was marked untenable, its people declared expendable. What remained of Volari's proud regiments had been left to rot, a dwindling force caught between starvation and the next inevitable assault. The betrayal was a wound deeper than any blade could carve, and Raul knew it festered in the hearts of his soldiers. Lieutenant Cale Drake had never tried to hide his fury. Scarred across the cheek, his glare burned hotter than the fires smoldering in the ruins. "We bleed for nothing," he spat as he stalked past the broken walls of their makeshift camp. "Every day we hold ground no one wants. Every day we scrape scraps from wreckage while our so-called allies toast their victories. What's left to fight for, Commander?" His words cut at the fragile silence, a voice for the bitterness many carried but few dared to release. Medic Terran Soak answered by action rather than speech. He bent over another coughing soldier, hands steady as he pressed cloth against a chest wound, eyes red-rimmed from exhaustion. Words were wasted in his view. He had spoken all the prayers he believed in months ago, when the supply ship still came. Now, only stitching and sealing kept his brothers alive, his silence serving as both shield and confession. He did not believe rescue was coming. Varric Lorn, the scout, lingered at the perimeter, recording notes on a battered pad. His wiry frame shifted constantly, restless as a predator caged. He mapped every patrol route, every crater, every broken tower, though the maps only told one truth: there was nowhere left to run. His journals had become less about tactics and more about memory, a desperate attempt to mark that they had existed at all. Among these men, Raul bore the quiet certainty of command. He had no speeches to rival Cale's fury, no salves beyond Terran's medicine, no records like Varric's. What he carried was resolve, carved into him across campaigns that stretched further than he cared to count. If despair devoured him, it would consume them all, and so he refused to feed it. His men might call him unyielding, but Raul knew the truth. He was simply terrified of what would happen if he bent. As dusk fell, they gathered near the remnants of a comms tower, its shattered antenna reaching like a skeletal arm toward the stars. Static had been their only company for weeks, and yet tonight the noise broke. Faint, fragile, and almost lost beneath the crackle came a voice, unfamiliar, clipped, speaking in a language they half understood but wholly recognized as foreign. It carried only 4 words, repeated in steady rhythm, words that froze the men in place. "You are not alone." The static swallowed the signal, then spat it back again. For words, fading in and out, until Cale snarled, "A trick. Bait to draw us out." Terran looked up from his patient, expression unreadable, while Varric's pen scratched furiously, as if writing the phrase might make it real. Raul lifted his gaze to the stars, throat tight. He had heard enough languages in his time to place the accent, the rough cadence. Human, the youngest species in the Council, the one mocked for crude ships and reckless tactics. They had been allowed into the galactic stage only recently, their strength dismissed as a passing curiosity. To many, they were an afterthought. Yet here, across the void, their words reached a battlefield no one else dared acknowledge. "They are coming," Raul said, not as speculation but as conviction. His men looked at him as though he had spoken madness.
Cale scoffed.
"You would place our fate in primitives? Better to trust the swarm, They at least are honest about wanting us dead. But Rawl's eyes did not waver. Something in that frail signal spoke louder than 100 council decrees, louder than every fleet that had fled. "We march at dawn," he declared, toward the signal. "If it is bait, we'll face it together. If it is not—" His pause carried the weight of all their losses, the hollow names of comrades buried in dust. "Then perhaps, at last, we are not forsaken." The night closed around them, filled with whispers of disbelief, anger, and fragile threads of hope. The ruins groaned with a shifting wind, but somewhere beyond the choking ash, beyond the orbiting carcasses of broken ships, lay men who had spoken into the void and promised they were not alone. The Volari survivors, ragged and scarred, did not yet believe in salvation. But they believed in Rawl, and for now, that was enough to set their feet forward. And as the faint words crackled one last time through the static, "You are not alone," something in their bones stirred, a memory of oaths once sworn, of brotherhood unbroken. It was not salvation yet, but it was enough to kindle the first fragile ember of defiance against the endless dark. "You said." The dawn march carried them through wastelands where silence felt heavier than stone. Broken towers jutted from the ash like the ribs of a long-dead giant, and every step echoed with the weight of futility. Rawl led without hesitation, though his soldiers muttered behind him. The signal's promise, those 4 words, still hung in the air like smoke, too fragile to grasp yet too stubborn to vanish. Cale grumbled curses at each ridge they climbed. Terran trudged wordlessly with his dwindling supplies strapped to his back, and Varric scanned every horizon as if expecting the swarm itself to spring from the shadows. Yet none of them turned away, bound not by hope but by the iron pull of Rawl's certainty. At last, on the 3rd dusk, they saw it, a vessel descending in firelight, cutting through the gray sky with engines that roared defiance at the void. Not the sleek craft of the Council, nor the massive dreadnoughts of Volari design. This ship was angular, rough-edged, scarred with repairs made in haste. A war machine, clearly human, yet alive with purpose. It landed in the ruins with a shuddering groan, metal grinding against shattered stone until the dust rose like a curtain around it. Weapons were raised at once. Cale barked for positions, his distrust sharp as ever. But Rawl only lifted a hand and stepped forward, eyes fixed on the hatch as it lowered. From the steel belly emerged figures clad in armor that was practical rather than ornate, painted not for ceremony, but for war. They carried themselves with the weight of men long accustomed to holding lines others had abandoned. The one at their front removed his helmet and met the Volari commander's gaze with steady calm. Broad-shouldered, hair streaked with gray, eyes carved with lines of fatigue, yet bright with iron will, this was Captain Elias Ward. He carried no grandeur in his presence, only the quiet authority of a man who had seen too many fields like this one. "We heard your call," Elias said, his voice resonant but unadorned. "We came because no one else would." The bluntness unsettled the Volari more than any speech of promises might have. Cale sneered, unimpressed. "A single ship with a handful of men. You think to save us?" Elias didn't flinch. "No," he answered evenly. "I think to stand with you. There's a difference." Behind him, the others disembarked. Sergeant Jace Corrin strode out like a man who thrived on conflict, scars across his arms visible even through armor, grin sharp as a blade. He looked at the battered Volari soldiers as if he were measuring them for fight, then barked a laugh that carried strangely across the silence. "Hell of a place to hold the line. Thought we'd find corpses, not men still standing." Lieutenant Marcus Hale followed with quieter steps, his expression calculating, gaze flicking from terrain to troop formations, as if already considering defense. He carried himself with precision, every movement efficient, his silence speaking of a mind always at war. The youngest was Corporal Devon Strath, barely more than a boy by human standards, yet he carried himself with the eager defiance of someone desperate to prove he belonged. His eyes widened at the Volari, not with fear but with the awe of a soldier who found brothers in strangers. Rawl studied them as his men shifted uneasily. Elias stood at ease yet unyielding. Jace radiated raw fire. Marcus embodied measured steel. And Devon was hope, untested but unbroken. This was no fleet, no rescue force. Yet there was something in their bearing that made Rahl straighten his spine. These men did not arrive to pity or to bargain. They had come to share the weight.
Chaol scoffed.
You expect us to trust you? Our allies abandoned us. Our council condemned us. Why should humans, last to the stars, weakest of them all, choose otherwise? Elias met the challenge without a flicker of offense. Because we know what it is to stand alone, he said simply. Because where we come from, we bury our dead ourselves, and we never walk away from a brother in arms. You've been forsaken. We won't forsake you. The words struck harder than any declaration of strength. Silence stretched, broken only when Jace tossed a ration pack toward a starving Vallari soldier with a careless grin.
Eat.
Fight better on a full stomach. His humor was rough, yet it loosened a few hardened jaws. Even Terran, long resigned to quiet despair, lowered his guard to accept a box of human medical supplies with a cautious nod. The men worked side by side before long, not as allies yet, but as soldiers sharing necessity. The humans built a field station among the ruins, tents rising with practiced speed, generators humming faint light into the shadows. Vallari hands joined in, skepticism giving way to the rhythm of labor. Weapons were compared, wounds dressed, bitter jokes traded in the universal tongue of men at war. Yet Chaol remained defiant. When Elias spoke of holding Arven for rather than fleeing, Chaol spat at the ground. You speak as though you'll die here gladly. We've had our fill of graves. We want extraction, not martyrdom. Elias's gaze hardened. Then you misunderstand. We don't fight to die, we fight so others live. Leave if you must, but we will not. If this is your grave, it is ours too. His conviction rang without arrogance, and for a moment even Chaol had no reply. That night, around the dim glow of the generators, soldiers of two species shared their first laughter. Jace sparred verbally with Chaol until grudging respect grew between them, each insult carrying less venom than the last. Marcus laid out defense grids with Varric, the scout marveling at strategies, both brutal and brilliant. Terran found human medicine stocked with tools he had never possessed, his silent gratitude evident in the care with which he touched each vial. Devon sat among the youngest Vallari soldiers, passing out bread with an easy smile, and when one of them whispered fearfully of tomorrow, Devon clasped his shoulder and said, "With you always." The phrase lingered. It passed between lips that had forgotten the shape of hope, tested at first in hushed tones, then louder, until men who had doubted rescue now whispered it to steady, trembling hands. With you always. Not a slogan of nations, not the decree of councils, but a soldier's promise spoken in firelight. Rahl watched as his men began, for the first time in months, to look not just at the ground before them, but at one another with something like belief. The humans had not brought salvation in ships of glory. They had brought something rarer, a brotherhood unasked for yet freely given. And as the night stretched, Rahl knew the signal had not lied. They were no longer alone. You said. The warning came with the low hum of scanners and the sudden tightening of Marcus Hale's jaw. His eyes fixed on the jagged horizon, reading the data with calm precision, though his voice carried the gravity of doom. They're moving. Carrick swarm, 2 clicks out. Fast. The words cut through the fragile calm like a blade. Vallari soldiers stiffened, fear sharp in their eyes. Memories of chittering hordes and razored limbs gnawed at their composure. Chaol slammed a fist against the wall of rubble they had been using as cover. I told you this would come. They'll overrun us by nightfall, and your brave words won't change it. His voice trembled with fury, but also with truth. Elias Ward stood at the center of the gathering storm, gaze fixed on the dust cloud rising in the distance. His face bore no illusion of safety, no attempt to deny the peril. Yet his words carried steel. Then we stand. If you fall here, so do we. We will not leave you to be slaughtered. Chaol spun toward him, incredulous. You'd waste your men for us? You think your handful of soldiers can stop the swarm that crushed fleets? Jace Corn barked a laugh, the sound jagged as shattered metal. Not stop. Hurt. Bleed them. Make them regret ever stepping on this ground. You've seen us fight. We're too damn stubborn to lie down. His grin was savage, daring the swarm to test it. Preparations began without hesitation. Marcus outlined positions with swift efficiency, sketching kill zones in the dust and assigning squads where terrain gave even the slimmest advantage. Varric shadowed him, noting choke points and paths through the rubble, marveling at the human's ruthless use of space. You carve the field like it's a weapon, the scout murmured, respect grudging but real. Marcus only nodded, eyes never leaving the battlefield he was shaping. Terran moved among the men, distributing supplies salvaged from human packs. His hands trembled as he checked gauze and stimulants, but he worked with renewed purpose, because now he prepared not just to slow death, but to preserve life. Across from him, Devon Strath crouched beside a Volari youth no older than himself, showing him how to prime a human rifle. "Hold steady," he said, voice low but firm. "Aim like you mean it. With you always." The phrase fell like an oath, and the boy repeated it under his breath, clutching the weapon as though it tethered him to survival. As the first shrieks split the air, the sky darkened with the swarm's advance. Shadows moved with sickening rhythm, insectoid limbs gleaming in the weak light, wings thrumming like thunder. The earth quivered under the approach, every man present feeling it in his bones. The battle began with fire. Trenches erupted in flame as humans unleashed grenades, while Volari rifles spat searing bursts of plasma into the horde. The swarm surged relentlessly, their bodies slamming against barricades, their screeches piercing the air. Men fought shoulder to shoulder, no longer questioning, no longer divided by suspicion. Cale found himself beside Jace, both roaring as they cut down wave after wave. Jace fought with reckless abandon, hurling himself into breaches with a combat knife when his rifle ran dry. Cale matched his fury, each strike burning away months of bitterness. Between gritted teeth he snarled, "You fight like a beast." Jace laughed, blood streaking his armor. "And you don't fight half bad for pessimist." Varric's maps guided ambushes where Marcus had placed charges, detonations collapsing buildings onto advancing lines, forcing the swarm into kill corridors. Volari and human alike poured fire into the choke points, the ground littered with shattered carapaces. For the first time since the Council's betrayal, the Volari saw their enemies falter, not by miracle, but by the stubborn will of men who refused to yield. Yet the swarm pressed on. They came in waves, endless and merciless, their shrieks echoing like the song of extinction. Trenches filled with blood, barricades splintered under their weight. Terran dragged the wounded back again and again, his hands slick with crimson, whispering hoarse encouragements he no longer believed but spoke nonetheless. Devon fell once, dragged down by a slashing limb. A Volari soldier pulled him free, and the boy gasped through pain, clutching at his savior's arm. "With you always," he whispered, and the words spread again like fire through dry grass. Soon the cry rang across the battlefield, shouted in two tongues, each man roaring it as defiance against the dark. In the chaos, Elias stood tall at the center, his rifle spitting bursts with unerring precision, his voice cutting through the din as he directed the lines. When men faltered, he pushed them forward with nothing but the conviction in his tone. When despair threatened, he answered with steady calm. And when the barricades collapsed, he strode into the breach, planting a human banner into the dirt with a defiant thrust. "If this ground is your grave," he roared above the swarm's screeches, "then it is ours too." The cry ignited them. Volari, who had once muttered of futility, surged forward with renewed rage. Humans fought beside them, laughter and fury mingling with blood and steel. The swarm reeled under the assault, momentum shattered not by superior numbers, but by the unbreakable will of soldiers who chose brotherhood over survival. Night fell with the battlefield still trembling, the air thick with smoke and death. The swarm, relentless by nature, withdrew at last, their broken forms littering the ground, their screeches fading into the distance. Silence returned, not of despair this time, but of disbelief. Men stood amidst the wreckage, bloodied and battered, staring at one another as if awakening from a dream. They had held. Against everything they had held. And in the darkness, lit only by the faint glow of smoldering wreckage, voices rose once more in a hoarse chorus. With you always. It was not a victory song, nor a declaration of triumph. It was a promise, spoken with cracked throats and trembling hands, but carved now into the marrow of both species. A promise that whatever came next, no man would stand abandoned again. The battlefield was quiet at dawn, though the silence was not peace but exhaustion. Smoke rose in thin ribbons from the carcasses of the fallen swarm, their jagged limbs jutting at unnatural angles across the ruined plain. The air stank of blood and ozone, every breath a reminder of the night's carnage. Among the broken barricades and collapsed walls, survivors moved with the slow, mechanical rhythm of men who had given everything and found themselves, against all reason, still alive. Commander Raul Varen stood at the edge of the devastation, surveying the wreckage with an expression both weary and unyielding. His armor was scored with deep cuts, one shoulder wrapped in a makeshift bandage that had bled through, but his stance remained tall. Around him, Volari soldiers whispered disbelief at what they had done. They had not been abandoned to death, not this time. Humanity had stood with them, and together they had driven the swarm into retreat. Captain Elias Ward emerged from the haze, helmet tucked beneath one arm, his face etched with fatigue, but illuminated by a spark of grim pride. His men had suffered as gravely as the Volari, yet their bearing had not diminished. Jace Corin limped on one leg, still cracking harsh jokes at Cale's expense. Marcus Hale crouched beside a ruined wall, already sketching fresh defenses in the dirt should the swarm return. Devon Strath, his arm bound tightly from a gash that nearly ended him, sat among Volari youths, speaking to them in hushed tones that carried more weight than any commander's speech. Cale approached Raul, blood crusted on his cheek, his bitterness replaced by something harder, tempered by fire. He stopped before Elias, studied him for a long moment, and then struck his chest with a clenched fist in the Volari salute. "I was wrong," he admitted, voice hoarse but firm. "You came not for glory. You came because you meant it. With you always." Jace grinned, answering with a rough slap to Cale's shoulder that nearly toppled him. The two men, once divided by distrust, now stood as brothers forged in the same furnace. Terran passed silently between the wounded, his hands steadier than they had been in months. His supplies were dwindling, yet the new weight in his gaze was not despair but purpose. Human medicine had given him tools, but human presence had given him something greater, the sense that his work mattered. Each bandaged wound, each soldier pulled back from the brink, was no longer just defiance of death. It was a contribution to a future that seemed, for the first time, possible. Varric wrote furiously in his journal, not simply recording the carnage, but capturing the words that had risen again and again in the darkest hours. "With you always," he inscribed across the page, underlining it until the paper nearly tore. He had written the last days of doomed men countless times before, but this record was different. This was not an epitaph. It was a beginning. Word of what had transpired spread faster than fire across dry plains. Scouts and traders carried the story through hidden channels, and soon the galaxy knew, where the Council had abandoned, humanity had endured. Where fleets had fled, a single ship had held the line. It was a tale whispered with awe in refugee camps, spoken with shame in the halls of power. The Council's silence grew heavier with each retelling, their cowardice exposed by the raw defiance of men who refused to yield. For the Volari, the impact was immeasurable. They had been condemned to die, yet they stood breathing still, not because of salvation delivered from above, but because brothers of another world had chosen to share their fate. For humanity, the battle became something greater than a victory. It was a declaration. They had not entered the stars to conquer or to kneel, but to stand beside those left behind, no matter the cost. In the quiet after battle, Rahl sought Elias by the remains of the comms tower. The human captain leaned against twisted metal, gaze fixed on the horizon as though already bracing for the next war. Rahl approached, his step slow, the weight of unspoken words pressing against him. "You could have left," he said at last. "No one would have blamed you. The galaxy would not have cared." Elias turned, his eyes carrying the fatigue of 1,000 unburied dead, yet also the fire of conviction. "Perhaps the galaxy wouldn't," he said. "But we would. We carry our choices. If we leave brothers to die, we bury ourselves long before the enemy ever reaches us." Rahl bowed his head in respect, something he had not done in years. "Then know this. The Volari will not forget. Your words, your blood, your presence, they have bound us. When the swarm comes again, when the galaxy turns its back, we will remember who stood." The soldiers gathered that night in a circle, humans and Volari together, their fires dim but their spirits alight. No speeches were given, no oaths carved in stone, yet every man there knew they had forged something enduring. Not alliance in the language of diplomats, but brotherhood in the marrow of warriors. They shared food, patched armor, tended wounds, and when the silence stretched too long, Devon spoke softly, voice still hoarse from pain. "With you always." The words rose in answer, first a murmur, then a chorus, carrying into the night as both promise and creed. The phrase spread, not through decrees but through men who had lived it, painted onto armor, etched into blades, carved into the walls of outposts where soldiers stood against impossible odds. It became a beacon not only for Volari and human, but for any who had felt the sting of abandonment. A reminder that though the galaxy was cold and treacherous, there were still those who would not walk away. When dawn rose again, it found survivors scarred yet unbroken, their ranks smaller but their resolve immeasurable. They had faced annihilation and discovered something greater than survival. They had found each other. And in that fragile light, as smoke drifted across the ruined fields and the dead were laid to rest, the truth settled into every heart present. The galaxy had turned away, but humanity had stood. Not as saviors, not as conquerors, but as brothers, forever with them. "You said,